It's a clash of concept albums as we pit 1969's groundbreaking Tommy against the moody, ambitious Quadrophenia from 1973. Which opera reigns supreme? Is it the deaf, dumb, and blind pinball wizard's journey, or the raw, rebellious soul of a mod named Jimmy? Stay with us to find out.
Get ready for the 3324 podcast, where lifelong friends Dean Legiro and Eric Kuber share their love of all things music and movies. Dean has directed short films and is a music trivia buff. And Eric, trained in audio engineering, brings his extensive knowledge of music and film to the conversation as they discuss, debate, and celebrate their favorite albums, films, and much more.
Welcome, friends, to the 3324 podcast. Eric, we are renewed. We're energized. We are ready to rock and roll.
We are. Yes, indeed.
We are.
And rock and roll is the
Put your hands in the air like you just don't care.
Chris isn't into that. I don't think.
Well,
I think
throw the horns. I'll throw the horns.
He's tired. I think he
would have known. I could have said we all have our hands in the air, and they would have just gone with us. It's theater of the mind.
There you go.
We can create any imagery that we like, but
unless you're watching on YouTube.
Okay. Yeah, unless you're watching on YouTube. If you are watching on YouTube, go ahead and give us a like and subscribe since Mr. Christopher Clark, our guest, teed that up for me so perfectly.
I was going to say that was all intentional.
Yeah, go ahead and like and subscribe so you find out the latest and greatest from the 3324 podcast when our new episodes come out. And if you're on Instagram and Facebook, you can follow us there for all the gory details as well. And we post when the new episodes come out. Big hint is they're on Thursdays. If you want to take that next step and support independent content creators like the guys you're listening to right now, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/3324. Become a Green Room supporter. That would you'd be aces in our book, Eric, right? They'd be top shelf.
Absolutely.
Buymeacoffee.com/3324. So, like I said, we've got Christopher Clark here with us. And we are doing an interesting episode because this is the first time we're really tackling. This is like a twofer.
Yeah,
it's like
it's an interesting
if you're
one.
into comics from the 70s, this is like a Marvel team up. Which would always be Marvel team up with Spider-Man with always someone from the Marvel universe, and then the next issue would be Spider-Man with somebody else, and
or the Super Friends.
We've done artist overviews. Right, we've done like Creedence, overview and Cheap Trick and a couple others. But now we're kind of taking two albums that are very near and dear to Eric's heart, and kind of comparing and contrasting them, and not in a bad way. This isn't a slam fest, but I thought it would be fun to have Eric represent what is his favorite Who album. Is that correct? Quadrophenia?
That's correct.
That is your favorite Who album, and it's in your top 10 of albums of all time, or top 5?
Top 3.
Top 3. He's got it down to 3. So what are the other 2 then? since it's 3.
My other 2 would be Pet Sounds.
Okay. Wow.
And So is up there.
Wow. All right. That's an eclectic.
Yeah. So
cross section, 60s, 70s, and 80s.
These are albums I guess I just can't live without. If you're going to go there, the whole desert island thing, these would be probably my top 3 right there. Yeah.
Cool. And when I was thinking about Quadrophenia and the episode, I'm like, the Who is really a very unique band because Pete Townsend is very much into the notion of a quote unquote rock opera, and we're going to get to that distinction in a little while. I want to put you guys to the test to that. So what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of contrast the two. Eric will advocate for Quadrophenia, and Chris will advocate for Tommy. And I'm going to ask a series of questions that kind of can be posed to both, and they'll just kind of give us their thoughts on where Quadrophenia sits in that conversation and where Tommy sits in this conversation. Like I said, because it's very interesting that the Who kind of occupy this interesting space. And when I was looking at this, I was kind of just like going through, because it's unique that they have 2 rock operas and should have actually had 3, which I'll get to. They only put out 4 actual albums in the 70s.
Yeah.
besides like the odds and besides all the compilations and stuff.
It leads. Yeah,
another band that you think is so prolific, you think that they have such a big catalog, but they do just because of the massive opus works that they put out in one shot.
And a lot of compilations, like a lot of their
compilations.
Yeah.
Especially
but when you think about
the Who's Next sessions, the whole like Lifehouse thing.
Exactly.
Which we're going to get to. Exactly. A lot of stuff.
That's a wonderful box set too, by the way. Yeah.
So let's do something that we've never done before. We're going to do the stats, but we're going to do the stats for 2 albums. This is going to be a double. So put your listening caps on. The first one, we'll talk about Tommy. That was released in May of 1969, produced by Kit Lambert. Hit number 4 on Billboard, 2 times platinum. So that's 2 million copies sold. Quadrophenia, released in October of 1973. So 4 years later, produced by The Who this time.
Yes.
It hit number 2 on Billboard, but only went 1 times platinum.
Interesting. Yeah.
Interesting. It charted higher, but sold less.
Yeah. Probably had singles too, I would venture to guess.
Tommy had Pinball Wizard, I'm Free, See Me, Feel Me. Quadrophenia had 515, Love Reign Over Me, and Real Me.
Real Me, yeah.
So they, when you're comparing, they're pretty much apples to apples. I would say, I don't know. I mean, if you take those 3 singles from each album and compare them, I'd be hard pressed to pick one. I would probably go with the Quadrophenia stuff only because it's later. For me, I like later sounding Who.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But that's not dismissing the 3 singles from Tommy as well.
No. And make no mistake. I mean, we're this is a really interesting way of doing this, but I think Chris, you might agree. Both albums are masterpieces.
Right. I was going to say we're comparing, like we're going back and forth, and I really think this is a discussion of a matter of preference more so than it is a matter of which one is better.
Yep.
Exactly.
Because both of them really, they're masterpieces in their own way, and they're both just the fact that they both came out of one person is pretty remarkable. Especially when you consider that even though there's an incomplete opera in between, that incomplete opera is genius, and the leftovers from that opera are considered by many to be one of the greatest rock and roll albums ever recorded. Like it's really quite staggering.
So let me go there because that's what I had next. Is there's an interesting 3 album cycle in the life of the Who, starting with Tommy. So the Who had done I think 3 albums before that, or 2 albums before that. And that was the typical 60s kind of stuff that you were getting from them. And then they really start to get ambitious with this. And so they released Tommy, which was called a rock opera, a double album. There's a story, a well-defined story in there. You can, and full disclosure, I've never listened to Tommy in its entirety until today, the whole thing. And I've never listened to Quadrophenia. So I gave myself which I loved because I gave myself both experiences fresh without any judgment, so Tommy comes out in 1969. Their next release was going to be another rock opera, right? It was going to be, and we talked about it in our Who's Next episode. So go refer to that. And Eric went into that, pretty in depth. It was supposed to be called Lifehouse, and actually is called Lifehouse, I guess, in one form or another, right, Eric? I mean, it's it kind of exists.
An ambitious, very ambitious. He was really leaning into the whole sort of multimedia thing. It was going to be a lot bigger. It was going to be a movie. It was going to be, the Who performing live, filming that and making that part of the movie. And it's just this really, really bizarre concept. But he had some brilliant notions, though, that were frankly ahead of its time. He was talking about the internet. Before there even was an internet. He was referring, he's like coming up with this idea of people kind of tuning into a worldwide communication kind of thing to kind of, because they're not allowed to play music. That's a familiar theme that runs through, a lot of subsequent rock operas down the road. But but yeah, I mean, he conceived of such things like just, to say that he's not one of those, really genius sort of eccentric type people. I mean, he's very, take up the same air as like Brian Wilson and, these guys are just
100%.
Absolute, sure. Like put them in a room together and there'd be like, I could just imagine the conversations that might ensue. But yeah.
Go ahead, Chris.
And just to build on what Eric is saying and what you have said already, you could make the argument that you don't really get an album by the Who. You don't get an album by the Who without a concept until you get to the Who by numbers. Because if you really follow along, the second Who record, A Quick One, has a 15-minute mini opera that I've heard Pete Townsend refer to as Tommy's Parents, called A Quick One While He's Away, about a woman who cheated on her husband. And then the Who sell out a collection of songs that are not linked in any way. They are linked because if you listen to that record plays like a pirate radio station in England in the 60s. So there's all these like commercials in between the songs.
Right.
So that record has a concept. So there's every record in some way from the second Who album until Quadrophenia has some kind of story or concept that he worked into the music. It's really not until they do By Numbers where it's just a collection of rock and roll songs. And that's 75 right. or 76. So that's more than 10 years into their career before he breaks that kind of cycle.
Yeah. So the Lifehouse project would be abandoned and it would become Who's Next, which is probably like the pantheon of Who albums. I mean, if it's an indication of what the Lifehouse project would have been, if this is just like the shavings from it and cobbled into an album, it's nothing short of spectacular. And then they go, then into Quadrophenia. So that literally would have been 3 concept albums in a row. So let me put it to Chris and then Eric take over. If he had finished the Lifehouse project, do you think there would have been a Quadrophenia?
I'd like to think there would be, because I just think that's the way his mind works. I think he would have, I think a lot of his career spent reflecting on who he was and where he came from and
who he was. Nice.
That's going to happen a lot.
Who are you? Yes.
I see what you did there.
But I think this is like, I think once he said, okay, I'm done with Who's Next or the concept of Lifehouse, once he got through that and that came out of him, what came out of him next was Quadrophenia. So I don't know if it would have been in the same form. I don't know if it would have been in 1973 or later, but I think in some point in his career, you would have seen some variation on what does become Quadrophenia. I really do believe that.
Eric?
I think I might agree. I think it might have been done. I think he did approach it actually from a different standpoint. He wanted, because Lifehouse failed, Quadrophenia was meant to be the next live vehicle for them to tour Tommy, because that's all they did was tour Tommy. So they were, I guess, getting a little sort of burnt out from that. And Lifehouse took a lot out of him because it failed. Quadrophenia was meant to be the new, like, something to perform, but of course that didn't work out either. Right. But anyway, but for me, I think it's more or less somewhat autobiographical in the sense that it's also a sort of a nice callback to the Who's career, because they started out as a mod band, very single oriented. These albums are cobbled together with just a lot of singles, songs that, and he, kind of conceived of the notion of being somewhat nostalgic, and because it would have been like 73 would have been 10 years since they started. So it would, so there was that. And then of course Pete Townsend,
which back then was long in the tooth for rock.
That's right. Rock and roll, that's unheard of. Yep.
We still didn't know what the shelf life would be for rock and roll.
Well, Tommy in itself was the breakthrough album for them, because they were really good. They admitted they weren't really going anywhere with these with that sort of poppy type stuff that they were doing. They needed something, and they thought Tommy would be like might have been the last out great thing that they did. Would they supersede that? even, but they had no idea how popular it was going to get and how much of a monster. And, even in the touring circle, I mean, the performances, that's the stuff that I love is when you hear that album done live, it's fantastic. So
yeah. And by the time we got to, or they got to Who by Numbers, Townsend was closing in on being 30, and he was very depressed because he did not know are rock musicians, do they go past 30, and what happens? And he felt like he was burnt out, and he had hit a roadblock. So he had really kind of given up to the Who all of this creativity in a relatively short span of time. I mean, from 69 to 73, that was ostensibly 3 massive projects, not just 3 albums.
Right. Yeah.
3 big things in 4 years. So, which leads to the question, and I'll put it out there. Eric can take it first. What's the difference between a rock opera and a concept album, or is there a difference? Because the term rock opera, you really, for the most part, only ever hear it ascribed to the Who. To a lesser extent, probably other bands, but when you say rock opera, you think Tommy.
Yeah.
And maybe nowadays you'll think American Idiot, but for the purposes of this conversation and at that time, concept albums were a big thing, right? Because you had Jethro Tull, you had Moody Blues, you had all these bands that were kind of doing that kind of stuff. But what separates a rock opera from that?
That's a really good question, actually. I would just say that, I mean, just the form. I mean, I know Kit Lambert was very instrumental in getting Tommy off the ground whenever Pete Townsend was feeling a little like, not so confident in it, because there were some numbers that he wasn't keen on and things like that, and just felt like it was just a little too quirky, maybe, or something. And Kit Lambert who was their his producer at the time, was like encouraging him. No, this is, fuck them. They're, this is, because he'd be like, this is very pretentious. This is, what is it? And he was questioning these things. And he was always, no, man, this is the new, because in Kit Lambert's mind, he was thinking that there really wasn't at the time nothing was really going on in the classical world or even an opera per se. So the idea, I think, was more likely conceived by him, excuse me, to kind of coin that phrase and to say, well, we could do something that is sort of operatic in tone and in form. And that could be easily translated to, which it was much later on, into classical albums, symphonic albums, a movie, and now a stage play.
I was going to say theater.
It's just a fantastic, show. And it kind of lend itself to that spectrum, I feel. Quadrophenia, on the other hand, I don't, to me, that album's more cinematic. I see that as a movie, more or less than a rock opera. I don't know if that's the right term for Quadrophenia. I was naive to think that back then, because I have heard Quadrophenia first, and I was 12 when I first heard that record. A cousin of mine, I was kind of looking at I was going through his record collection. I was looking at the cover, and I'm like, what is this? And he put it on for me. Oh, you want to hear it? He put it on, and I was amazed about the sort of the way it opened and all that. And I was just drawn in, and I was naive to think that every album was a concept album. Like if people made songs like that you hear on the radio, right? That's one thing. But then if you sit down and write an album, it has to tell a story. Yeah. Right. It's like and I guess that could be true of a lot of artists. I mean, there is sort of a common theme or something that somebody may go through. All the best albums, I think, are like that anyway. There is that commonality to the songs. They're kind of maybe not connected to tell a story, but there's a constant reoccurring sort of theme about love or whatever that they're writing about. But
so they could be loosely an overarching concept, but not necessarily a story. So,
and I think that happens a lot,
Yeah. Probably more than we think, because so when someone's writing an album, they may be affected by a breakup, or they may be affected by something happening, becoming a parent for the first time and scared about life or whatever. And we don't realize it, but that's informing all of the all of the material. So Chris, where do you fall in on this?
So
rock opera concept album before we get started.
So for me, like I always think of a rock opera, I think of like albums that tell a story. Like Tommy tells a story. Quadrophenia tells a story. Two other records that are really, I think, are two personal favorites: Operation Mindcrime by Queensryche or Scenes from Memory by Dream Theater. They're telling a story. Whereas a concept album, to me, I think of like a Sgt. Pepper, where we're this band and we're going to play this show for you, and all the songs are from the show, and then the end they come back out at the end and do the reprise, and so it's like sandwiched. Or again, like coming back to the Who Sell Out, where it's not necessarily where the songs tell a story, but they're all connected by the idea that you're listening to like Radio Caroline, and they're out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean illegally broadcasting back to England. So
an overarching theme.
An overarching theme would be what a concept record is to me, whereas an opera tells a story, and to Eric's point, kind of plays out like an opera or a play would. Like with Tommy, you've got the overture and the underture, and like it genuinely does have like an operatic or a theatrical type of form like that.
Yeah,
I definitely think, and if they don't have that, they can fit into that very easily, because every song tells a story like you would see in a Broadway play or in an opera kind of thing.
All right.
Well, good point. Yep.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get this started then. So I've got a series of questions, and we're going to randomly have Chris or Eric kind of take it, and then the other guy will kind of give their point of view from either the Tommy side or the Quadrophenia side. Again, it's not to bash one or the other; it's just to kind of advocate for each one or kind of spark the conversation. Because, like I said, it's very unique that a band would do this, and it's even more unique that they would do it so close to each other. It's one thing for a band to put out a concept album or something, and then to do it, try to do it 3 times in a row, but successfully do it, 2 out of 3 albums. So I guess the first thing I'll send it to Chris first. The first thought I had between these two are there any themes or concepts that are similar, or you feel continue from Tommy to Quadrophenia?
Well, the thing for me about Tommy is it's dealing with somebody and childhood trauma, which I know that's like a really kind of extreme form of childhood trauma. It's about a kid who witnesses his mother and father murdering somebody and then becoming catatonic because of it. But it's the idea of like the things you struggle with in youth and the things that you deal with in your life that you have to overcome because they're so traumatic for you. And I think Jimmy in Quadrophenia is dealing with, those growing pains that you go through in adolescence, and some people deal with them much harder than others. I mean, as somebody who teaches high school, I've seen kids really struggle and deal with a lot of difficulties going through that. And again, it's a theatrical version of that in Quadrophenia, but I think those are, for both of those records, I think they're relatable themes, and just the idea that these are all some things that we deal with as humans as we go through youth from being a child into adolescence.
Eric?
Yeah, I agree. And Pete Townsend is doesn't, he, again, very autobiographical in the sense where he's speaking about himself. He dives into his own personal experiences, friends that he's had. I think there's an interesting, story about like when kids were sent off during World War II, during the Blitz, like he had a lot of friends that were sent off to the countryside to stay with like foster families and things like that. And a lot of traumatic stuff happened with these families, a lot of fucked up stuff, unfortunately. And of course, when they came back to their families and they weren't allowed to share or express themselves or tell their story, because their parents were just like, shut up, you're lucky to be alive.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. So it was very sort of
you're
like,
just a kid anyway.
You're
stuff.
just a kid. You don't know, any better, that kind of thing. And so, he went through all that kind of stuff. And it's, Tommy is he actually goes even darker than he does with Jimmy. Because and almost to the point where Townsend wanted to write about this stuff, but he couldn't. He gave those songs to John Entwistle actually to write, like Fiddle About, and and he tried to make it sort of comical, but the real, come on, it's just,
if you really listen to the lyrics, there's some fucked up lyrics and things like Cousin Kevin and Tom and
Whistle had a way of creating those sort of quirky, sort of dark and brooding.
Yeah, I mean, Cousin Kevin is about him abusing Tommy. Like, I can,
right? He's a bully.
You're not going to respond. I can burn you with a cigarette because you're not going to. Will that garner a reaction out of you if I push you down the stairs?
Yeah, putting needles on your toilet seat.
Like crazy. So there is some.
Much more graphic. I mean, in the case of Jimmy with Quadrophenia, I think it's probably a little bit more relatable because I think we all of us, is we've gone through in one way or another. The what struck me about the album was the isolation factor, is how alone he feels and how confused he is about what's going on around him, and to the point where he actually has these 4 separate personalities that are mirrored with each member of the Who, and that's where it gets a little Townsend getting a little clever there, but you take that cap off and you're dealing with the never-ending thing of adolescence, which is continuing to this day. And like Chris was saying, I mean, the kids are still struggling with it, so it's
But before I kick it over to Chris, Eric, give like Chris to give a quick synopsis of what Quadrophenia is about.
Okay, so Quadrophenia is about a mod kid, who growing up in 1964 England, where there's these 2 rival gangs that are like mods are well dressed. They ride these little scooters around. It's sort of like a fashion thing. It's almost like pre-punk in a way. They listen to certain types of music. They're not leather clad. They don't wear jeans. They wear like fashionable clothes. They have to comb their hair a certain way. This kid is confused in the sense that he tries to be like everyone else, but he doesn't fit in. He has a terrible home life. His parents don't, they're like very strict with him, and you need to live your life a certain way. And if you're not going to go to school, you got to work, you got to, so he's kind of drifting through adolescence in the sense where he's just feeling a lot of different things, and it's affecting him, his head. It's more Townsend kind of leaning into the sort of like mental illness factor where it's really messing him up in the sense where he's almost schizophrenic in that sense, where he's developing these poor personalities, and he's, he doesn't know where to turn. Everybody kind of
as a coping mechanism.
There is paranoia. There is, and of course, the people that are supposed to be his friends and important in his life, even the Who is his favorite band. Townsend kind of put that in there as well. They all let him down, and that's so to the point where you think that he may commit suicide. Yeah. But we don't know. Townsend left that open. He kind of wants the listener to interpret it and kind of bring your own story to it.
Yeah.
Which I think is that's what struck me about the album. That's what's important to me about it.
Right. So, Chris, what do you got?
I was going to say, just to kind of talk about things being relatable, and I know Quadrophenia is a little bit more relatable, obviously, because I think we've all struggled with those same kind of adolescent struggles. Yeah. I think one of the points that Tommy really does make and makes well, especially is being, knowing people who are very close to me who've struggled with mental illness, that idea of like suffering in silence. And I know in the album, he's catatonic, but just the idea of like suffering through all of this trauma, but then also being afraid to say anything and not knowing how to say anything. And how do I deal with this? And that idea of suffering in silence, because even now it's tough for a lot of people to try and have that conversation. So I think that's kind of a relatable theme to that record. And just from as the more I listen to it, and the more I think about it, especially thinking about it for this.
Right. Eric, which of the 2 concepts is a stronger story? Because they both kind of deal. We've kind of established they both deal with a similar thing, like some childhood trauma, right? And things, struggling with oneself, sense of identity in some aspects. So he's obviously revisiting these themes. So which one do you from a Quadrophenia standpoint?
Well, Quadrophenia, it's not. it's really not set up like Tommy in the sense where Tommy is more of a straightforward, from A to B. It's more of a linear type of thing. The circumstances, it's like a straight narrative. Where Quadrophenia kind of jumps around. I think there's some time shifts there. There's you don't really know exactly. You're kind of thrust in the middle of certain things, and then with each side, it's almost like each side represents a different time and place in his, in his funk or whatever, melees or whatever it is that he's dealing with. I feel like Tommy might have the better, the stronger story, because it is because all these other things just happen, that transpire once he's freed from this catatonic state, and now he becomes this sort of spiritual. So this is where the sort of the 60s mindset is kicking in here, where it's more of a spiritual journey. He feels like his experience. And, if you look at it from that standpoint today, if something were to happen to a kid like this in real life, and he just sort of came out of it, it would be sort of sensationalized, I'm sure. And to the point where people would be really interested in that story, but only to a certain point until, something else comes along or,
the new flavor of the month
story. and I feel like that's what happens with Tommy. He gets to that point where it's he thinks he's so important and some sort of guru or something like that. And it really, kind of doesn't work out for him because that they don't want to put up with that anymore. There's a, I don't know if it's a facade or if he's a phony or whatever. But Quadrophenia, I feel like it's to me, it represents more real life, I guess. It's more grounded in reality. And I guess, so whereas, Tommy takes you on that sort of surreal, journey, yeah.
All right, Chris, where do you land on that? Which one is stronger?
I mean, I started listening to Tommy. It's probably the first Who album I ever really remember listening to. I still distinctly remember when they came back for the 1989 reunion tour, and my dad sitting on his bed recording.
That's when I saw them, I think.
Yeah, recording that Radio City concert on NEW, and then constantly playing that tape in the car. So, and I feel like I remember at a very young age being able to follow that story, and I always found it much easier to follow than Quadrophenia. And I don't know if that's just because I didn't spend as much time with Quadrophenia as I did with Tommy, but I always found Tommy easier to understand. And I even think, to that point, didn't the record come with kind of guidelines and or an explanation of the story? Yeah, that's what I mean.
Quadrophenia came with a booklet.
Yeah, to try to kind of explain this. I guess that in and of itself would say that Tommy was a little bit of an easier story to follow. But for me personally, I always found Tommy easier.
Okay. That's the fact we're also dealing with multiple characters too in Tommy's story. So you're hearing, different perspectives and different.
Yeah, you've got the Acid Queen, you've got Cousin Kevin.
Right. Yeah. And these people sort of narrating as they go along, maybe unreliable narrators for sure, but they're furthering the story along and they're letting you know
whatever their agenda is, right? Yeah, right. Whatever their agenda is.
Yeah. So, who they are to his life and all that stuff.
Okay. No, so this leads me right into my next question, and I want to split you guys on this one. So I want Chris to specifically take Tommy, and I want Eric to specifically take Quadrophenia. Chris, which one of these? If someone's going to listen, if someone never heard these, take me or somebody, and they're I'm only going to listen to one of these. They're double albums. It's a lot for me. I'm only going to listen to one. Why is Tommy an easier listen than Quadrophenia? And Eric, why is Quadrophenia an easier listen than Tommy? So Chris, go first.
I feel like Tommy, the songs are a little bit more earwormy in most cases than some of the stuff on Quadrophenia. I feel like the songs stick in your head a little bit more. They're a little bit more memorable. Not that Quadrophenia isn't memorable, but I feel like Quadrophenia takes a few more plays, whereas I feel like Tommy might be a little bit easier to absorb. And I also feel like Tommy appeals to people various sensibilities. Like I feel like I could put Tommy on for a friend of mine who likes, harder rock and classic rock and, that kind of stuff. But I also feel like I've put that album on in the car with my wife, who is much more of somebody who has a larger pop sensibility, and it appeals to her as well. So I feel like it's a record that kind of hits a lot of spots very quickly. Whereas again, Quadrophenia it's a brilliant record and I really do love it, but I feel like it takes a little bit more to absorb. So if someone's only going to listen to one, I feel like Tommy would be the one to listen to first.
Right. Eric, flip that coin over. And I actually have an opinion on this, so I'll go last. I have a short opinion.
It is Quadrophenia for me. Like I said, it's cinematic, and being I'm such a lover of film, I got that right away. It's also harder edged. I love the sound of the Who. At this point, I think the performances on the record are just the closest thing they ever came to sounding live on record, in my opinion. I think there's a lot of instrumentation happening on this record. There's just a lot of sort of, songs just sort of go off, in a very musical like jam. There's a lot. I mean, they're just going all out on this thing. And I feel like that's a better representation of the Who than, if you look at Tommy, if you didn't know who the Who were, or what they were all about, you could easily just say, you're not that familiar with the band as a rock and roll band. I think with Tommy, it is an easier listen in the sense that, like Chris was saying, you have like shorter songs. You got these little interludes. You got these little whimsical numbers, and yeah, I could see where somebody might be more interested in, because it's so, a lot of the songs on Quadrophenia, like there's repetitive motifs. There's a lot of same type of playing, the bass and the drums, just kind of on a lot of the songs are very, very similar in the way they're executed. Mm-hmm. It's more of a rock and roll record, I feel. Mm-hmm. It's just sort of more, it's a harder edged, and, again, this is what the Who, for me, this is what they were all about. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's an easier listen, but I think for me, it's a preferable listen. I would recommend, if you want to know who the Who are, check this one out. Okay. I think it's a better representation of the band and what they're capable of. So
I think the way I think of it is like this. Would it be, is somebody going to go and play side 3 of Tommy just randomly? Or would you get more out of playing side 3 of Quadrophenia? So what I mean is that to Chris's point, Tommy is such a tight-knit story that you kind of have to listen to the whole thing.
Right.
You can't really drop in on that. But I feel like Quadrophenia, you can kind of drop in on, mm-hmm. and kind of and listen to it since the concept isn't as razor sharp where Tommy is telling you everything.
Yeah.
I think you can drop in on Quadrophenia and just kind of listen to parts of it.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Right. Without having to, Tommy, you're not just gonna say, well, let's listen to side 2 of Tommy today. Right. You're going to listen to it.
But I also, in listening to Tommy, there are definitely times where I'll pull out certain songs. Like, obviously you could pull out Pinball Wizard. I always thought Sally Simpson was a really good song. I'm a Sensation. Yeah. I feel like stands on its own. To me, 1921 is one of the most beautiful and well-written things that Pete Townshend's ever written. So while, somebody might not say I'm going to only listen to side 3 of Tommy, I do think there are things that can be pulled out on Tommy and be listened to independent of the record itself.
Yeah. I think Quadrophenia just kind of fits more into like
because it's a fractured narrative.
For a casual listener, I think you can drop into Quadrophenia, right? Yeah. And not it leaves room for interpretation, right? It's not so rigid, but Tommy is great. When I listen to Tommy, I was like, oh, this is like listening to a story. Yeah. He's got to, pay attention to the lyrics and you're going to hear as he gets passed around and as he meets different characters and they tell you literally exactly what happens.
Which lends, it's like we were saying before, you getting back to the question of what is a rock opera kind of thing. It definitely lends to that format. much, much better than Quadrophenia does. But to your point, Dean, like you can drop in on, 515 to Bellboy, like at that, and that whole side is just each song I feel is telling the story.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to be like a linear thing. Each song represents what's going on in his head. In this particular case, it's all about him going back to, Brighton Beach,
mm-hmm.
and just that whole experience of him reflecting on and meeting, his hero, who turns out to be, he's working as a bellboy, and, that kind of thing. So that whole side represents that him taking the train and just getting the hell out of Dodge and just sort of going back to the place where he felt connected with the rest of the mods and that whole thing. And it's just that whole side in itself tells a story right there. But you could listen to but you do get the sense that you're being dropped into something.
Yeah.
Each time. So yeah,
well,
I would say that probably the hardest side to listen to would be side 4. Because it's very long, and it's like Dr. Jimmy kind of runs into, the rock, and it's really like it's long. I mean, by the time you get to Love Rain Over Me, it's like it's like a punch in the gut.
That's the payoff, though.
Yeah,
that you get like that. You get that vocal, like you get like the, they make you work for it.
Yeah.
So let me. Next question, Eric will take it first. I wrote the question a certain way, but I want to kind of change it. The question as I wrote it was, what technological advancements were made, if any? I want to change that to, and Chris will take it for Tommy in the reverse. Does Quadrophenia benefit from the Tommy experience? Meaning, is there a progression with the Who in form and function, or what Chris will take, was Tommy like the first thing and it was done the best way? So what, do you think Quadrophenia benefited from Tommy existing, or did it, was he able to expand on what he was doing, or is it kind of a lot of the same things or tricks kind of, just done again?
I think
that's Eric's first.
I thought you said reverse. I thought you said reverse. That's my bad.
No. Meaning the reverse. Meaning you're gonna take it from the opposite. You're gonna take it from the opposite.
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely think they did grow and they did benefit. They learned a lot of things from that experience, but. With Tommy, they had Kit Lambert producing. They had an actual producer who, kept it pretty, the sound of that album is considerably different than the sound of Quadrophenia. So by the time they get to Quadrophenia, they had to do it themselves, and they didn't know what the fuck they were doing. Is that
a bit of a liability then, you're saying?
I don't think so, because I think it shows a growth in their ability. I mean, they said they didn't know what the hell they were doing, but they pulled it off, I think, beautifully. I think it's a really great sounding record.
Well, let me stop you there. Let me interrupt, because wasn't there an issue with the mixing of this album? Wasn't there? So
he wanted to record the album quadrophonically. Like, he was supposed to be in the studio. First of all, they were building a brand new studio to record it,
which didn't work.
It wasn't finished. They were actually recording as they were building the studio, and they had to hire Ronnie Lane's mobile unit to record a lot of the tracks on it, but then finish it in the studio once that part of the studio was done. But he wanted speakers all around the room. The studio actually resembles. I've watched the documentary, by the way, on this, and the way the ceiling is and the acoustics of the studio, he's, this is going to be great because it's going to, but what happened was it didn't sound great. He was very impressed with what Pink Floyd were doing with Dark Side of the Moon. Mm-hmm. They were recording their stuff quadrophonically with like Money, all the different sounds coming in from different directions. That he hoped to achieve that with this album, but that's not what happened. Everything kind of sounded really mono to him. So they had to record it in stereo, and that's the way it was. But until the 40th anniversary mix, which they fixed, it's called the director's cut.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, I think those experiences, I mean, with Tommy, definitely, and also performance too. You're talking about like Townsend writing certain songs. He thought he conceived of a way like I was going to do this song a certain way, but realizing that Roger Daltrey was the right person to write for, to sing certain types of things, and Daltrey pulling it off and surprising him with certain aspects of that. So I think that also kind of, lent itself to, at this point, I think they were kind of used to the whole like coming in and putting down what Pete wrote for them specifically for each member of the band to do. Mm-hmm. I think at this point they just, it was just kind of expected, so they just kind of knew
trusted that he was,
they trusted that he knew how to write for each individual member. And I think that really shows on Quadrophenia,
All right.
So, yeah.
So Chris, Tommy, how does it have the advantage technologically, or, it being the first? Does that give it a little? Does that give it extra points for them pulling it off the first in 1969 when something like this was largely unheard of?
I mean, the only one that I ever heard was around before Tommy was SF Sorrow by the Pretty Things, and I don't know if that actually. I mean, Eric could probably speak to this better than I can. I don't know if that actually inspired Townsend, but I also know that like he was. I also feel like everything was a progression. So like you go from a quick one, which is like a 15-minute mini opera, then you have the concept and Sell Out, and then you get to Quadrophenia. I just feel like one builds on the other, and I don't feel like you get to what Quadrophenia became without going through all of those phases first. And I think Tommy, to come up with something like that when none of your contemporaries are really doing anything like that, to say, I'm going to use a non-rock and roll, non-pop format to create this brilliant piece of music that's going to endure for the next 50 some odd years, I think that's really brilliant to say when nobody else had ever done anything like that before. And again, the lessons that you learn in Tommy and then Lifehouse are what get you to Quadrophenia, where he takes the format and does something a little bit different with it. And I think,
I can't help but think they owe a debt to Sgt. Pepper of just what could be possible.
Right.
Because
not be afraid to do something like this. Exactly.
Yeah, the Who were very much like Eric said, they were a singles band and they were kind of rough and tumble in my generation, and they're smashing guitars, and they had this certain image, right? There was a kind of a thing, and and I'm going to now do the pun. Who knew that Tommy was something that this group that had no kind of connection to that could come up with, right? Like, again, totally, subverting what the expectations are from this group, because you had Magic Bus and you had that kind of that Brit pop stuff with a little bit more of an edge. But then, in 1969, out comes this expansive story, which is extremely well thought out, right? I mean, it's not like Sgt. Pepper where we find out, oh, that was just kind of the overall kind of name for it, and John Lennon was like, well, we really weren't, it was just kind of, I had my songs, It
was like the way they sandwiched the album. This is the band we're going to play for you, and this is us coming back out at the end to say thank you.
And that was pretty much it. It was like, I came up with this wacky idea that we could be somebody else,
right?
Which did give license to a lot of groups to think outside the box, and the Who were probably one of the first bands to really kind of crystallize that idea and really kind of go for it. I mean, you did see the Moody Blues kind of start that kind of stuff as well, but this is literally with different characters and different points of view, and just like this encompassing story. So it is. And in this way, I kind of give it to Chris that without Tommy, without that experience, by the time we get to 1973, like the Who, they actually sound different.
Yeah,
Roger Daltrey sounds different. He does not, in Tommy, he still has the 60s Daltrey voice. He wasn't really. He wasn't really throating it yet, like he would, like, when I think because we Won't Get Fooled Again in between,
right?
And we get Who's Next, which again is a different Roger Daltrey, a more confident and a more, dare I say, plantish, meaning that he now uses the velocity of his
belts
voice.
It out, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So when we get to Quadrophenia, we're to Eric's point, we're getting a much more confident version of the Who that went through the process of Tommy and now can understand what is entailed with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then really kind of let it out there, Chris.
And I mean, and to your point too, and I think Eric said this earlier, they played a lot, and they played Tommy a lot. And if you listen to any of the recordings of Tommy, and I would highly recommend the one on the expanded box of Live at Leeds, he is singing the way he's going to sing on stuff like the Who's Next record and the Tommy record. You see that come out of him when he starts to perform Tommy live.
It's always been my preferred, because by and large, I mean, Tommy's great, but it's like there are certain songs that, by comparisons, are very timid.
Yeah,
but no less emotional. I mean, he does reflect. I mean, he does. I mean, like "See Me, Feel Me," for example, on the album is very it's very timid, but it's still like Townsend couldn't do that.
Tender. Yeah, it's tender.
That was one of the things that Townsend pointed. He goes, I thought that I would have sang that, but then I heard, I came into the studio and Roger was laying that vocal down, and I was amazed at how emotive that was and how beautiful it was, and so you're getting those different facets there. But yeah, man, when they started playing that stuff live, especially like Woodstock and the "See Me, Feel Me," that particular version of that it's on the "Kids Are All Right" soundtrack. I always loved that version more because it was just so brass and loud, and that's when they became like a hard rock band.
Yeah, I mean, and even
they changed their image. Yeah,
and even going back to that idea of like Daltrey becoming more into himself, there are tracks on Tommy that Townsend sings that then Daltrey takes over live, like 1921.
Yes,
on Tommy is sung by Townsend, but live Daltrey sang it and really made it his own. And to the point where when I was a kid, until I really stopped to listen and think about it, I always thought it was Roger Daltrey singing 1921 until I got older and paid attention.
Yeah. Yeah, there is, even on Quadrophenia, there's a couple of tracks that Townsend is singing with Daltrey. He's not really harmonizing, but he's like sort of singing. He usually sings the bridge. Daltrey takes the lead. He takes the verses. Townsend comes in with these remarkable bridges, which I think are great. And then it goes back to the like Punk and the Godfather, for example. There's that wonderful bridge where it kind of quiets down a little bit, and then it just like erupts, and you hear the crowd, and like the sound effects on the record too are just. I love that. That really caught my attention too, is the fact that Townsend went around and recorded all of these like sounds himself. Spent a half the summer doing it too, which was, and then laying that all into integrating that into the record is just
commitment.
Yeah. Yep.
So as we start to wind down, there's the thing about these rock operas is they do get adapted into other forms, and in this case, both of these were made into films. So Tommy has had a lot more other things, but Quadrophenia was made into a film with our man Sting early on, very very young, very young Sting. But Tommy was a product of its time as well. Just with it's a trip. So which Chris, how does Tommy measure up to the source material? And Eric will talk about Quadrophenia.
The thing that threw me off, I remember seeing it again because I got really into it. So my dad, being my dad, was like, well, if you listen to the record, you should see the movie. And I remember watching Tommy as a kid and having to adjust to the fact that they tried to make it about post-World War II instead of post-World War I. So 51 instead of 21. And then the movie actually changes the narrative, and they make it that the boyfriend kills the father instead of the father killing the boyfriend, which then threw me off later. So, but I will say, as a kid, I thought the movie was really cool, like Elton John and the Big Boots and all the rock stars that, I learned about at my father's feet were all in this movie. And I thought it was really cool, but I can't really speak to which one is more. And I thought it was, for the most part, fairly true to the source material. And I always thought it was very cool to hear Clapton's interpretations and Elton John's interpretations and Tina Turner's. Like, I thought it was really cool to hear those songs filtered through their contemporaries. I've never seen Quadrophenia, so I'm not going to pretend that I did, but I mean, Eric could probably speak to that better than I could. But I will say I thought Tommy, the movie, for all intents and purposes, was very faithful to the source.
I think I was thought about this the other day. There's two instances with Elton John where I heard him do covers, and those were my first time hearing the songs. The first time I heard for years Pinball Wizard was the Elton John version, because that's what they played on the radio.
Mm-hmm.
My son, who likes Elton John, heard that version first, and I said, well, if you like that, then you should listen to The Who, and that's what got him listening to Tommy, was Elton John.
And then Elton John's version of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, that used to always be on the radio, and I heard and was familiar with that before I ever heard the Beatles version.
But the ironic too is like that's from the Sgt. Pepper movie, right? Is it? Doesn't he do that? I'm
not sure if that was from. I
don't think it was earlier than that. No, it was early. It was definitely
earlier. It was in like the mid '70s, I think. And it was
Elton John even in that movie?
Because I didn't see Sgt. Pepper. I didn't see that. I never saw that movie.
If you mention that movie in front of my father, the next words out of his mouth are, "That ruined Peter Frampton's career."
Oh, I thought he was going to say Felix Pappalardi was the producer.
No, he was not. Although RSO did produce it, who Felix Pappalardi was associated with.
Yep. All right, so Eric, talk about Quadrophenia film, because there's no denying it is a much lesser known film when compared to Tommy.
It is
because of everything that because the stage show of Tommy and all that. So let's
just put it out there. I mean, Quadrophenia has always, and I think still does, stand in the shadow of Tommy, in terms of its just appeal and popularity. We'll get to that
and the legacy also. Yep.
Right. But the movie of Quadrophenia is it's pretty straightforward. I mean, the director, Frank Rodham, he decided to tell the story like almost documentary style. So it's just a drama. It's not a musical. They're not busting into song. The songs actually are needle drops in this, which I find to be a bit redundant, frankly. I think the songs are intrusive, actually, because they're kind of just sort of like reminding you of what the scene is playing out. You're watching it, you see what's happening. The songs kind of it's almost like a thought bubble popping out of nowhere,
like an audio cue.
Exactly. And I didn't think that the songs were necessary. So you have the album, which the movie's already there. To me, it's like the album is the movie.
Yeah.
So the movie, I and while I liked it, but it's a different experience. Tommy, on the other hand, is, it does lend itself to the source material better, because because it's so like, imaginative and brazen and colorful and it's this, this trippy, like,
and you have Anne Margaret, so
Oliver Reed, and you got all these, like, he plays the boyfriend.
I just read a funny story about Oliver Reed, because he was such a drinker. He's known for like, and he said, when I die, I've left enough money for everybody to go, once the funeral is over, everybody's going to go to a pub. Yeah. And all the drinks are on me. We're just going to have a party and all the drinks are on me. And he goes, and I'm the one regret I have in life is that I did not get to visit every pub in England or Scotland, whatever it was. It was like his whole regret in life was about not drinking enough.
Oh my God.
And then his final wishes were, I have enough money put aside that once the funeral thing is over, everybody go to the local pub and all the drinks are on me. So
that's hilarious.
That's Oliver Reed in a nutshell.
But I just to, further the comment, I think the stage play is actually better than the film, where the translation for this to the stage with
for Tommy,
unknown actors, but talented actors playing it out. I think it works very well. I was blown away when I first saw it at the St. James, when the first run it came out. It was
what?
I didn't expect.
Wait, Chris is shaking his head. Is that a bad thing? Or
it's just when people talk about Tommy, one of my great, like, I've seen a lot. I've been very fortunate in my life to see a lot of theater, the one show that I've always wanted to see was Tommy.
Oh.
And I never got around to getting tickets when I was a teenager. And then when it came back around, I said to my wife, we are going to see this fucking play. And it went off Broadway, and it went out to TDF where I could get like $50 tickets because nobody was going to see it. Yeah. And my calendar just didn't align to see it. So one of my great regrets of things I haven't gotten to see is I never got to see Tommy on Broadway in either of its iterations.
Oh, so, it's amazing. Yeah, and I actually got the cast recording, and I was listening to that more than the album. It's the original album itself, because I was even that was great. I just kept playing.
Did they add any extra material in, or they just because sometimes they'll throw some other songs in to kind of kind of bolster it a little bit,
connect everything together. Yeah.
He wrote, I think there's 3 or 4 songs. I think that he wrote specifically for the play.
So it was extra material.
But he also wrote 3 songs for the movie for Quadrophenia too,
there you go.
which appeared on the soundtrack. So they were, so he was even furthering that. Which again,
equal time. I appreciate that he.
Yeah.
You get 3 and you get 3, just so that I'm not playing favorites. So as we close out, let's talk about Eric. You mentioned it a little bit, but we'll have Chris started off about the legacy of both of these releases and their influence. I mean, obviously we can point to an easy one for me to point to is Green Day, right? They kind of the notion of a rock opera kind of lay dormant for a long time, and you did mention Operation Mindcrime as well.
Yep.
But they've been few and far between.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say, like, again, not to keep this is, I guess, my ELO, but to keep coming back to
that's right.
Dream Theater, Mike Portnoy will point to The Who as being a huge influence on him, especially Keith Moon, but also how important Tommy was as an album to him as a kid. And throughout their career, they've done things like they had one record that had a 45-minute opera on it about the different mental health disorders. Mm-hmm. Their last record it's called Parasomnia, and every track is about a different sleep disorder somebody might deal with. They had another record that dealt with like trying to solve a murder mystery with all kinds of different themes in it. So I know they've always been big on it. Queensryche, I know, has done one. Green Day, but beyond that, you're right. I can't think of. Or Iron Maiden, I'm sure Jerry would get a little mad if we didn't mention this. Iron Maiden did Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, right? You had.
I think the music of I think Eddie Vedder's lyrics in Pearl Jam, where he is definitely absolutely, his ability to talk about emotional things and talk about, because he talks a lot about that kind of stuff too. Childhood trauma, not knowing who his father was.
He's a big Who fan too, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
He's a big Who fan,
and not knowing who his father was, and that song "Alive," and so it does manifest it, and if we're saying, and if we know Eddie Vedder was influenced by the Who, we've got to then take the next leap that these bodies of music were
100%,
especially when we know. Mm-hmm. What the subject material that Eddie Vedder was talking about. Eric, what do you think the legacy and the influence, and anything about the, obviously Tommy has the farther reaching legacy. I'm not going to necessarily say influence, but it's got the farther reaching legacy because of the play. And just because when you say the Who, Tommy, you're like, oh yeah, okay.
Right. Yeah. I think like Quadrophenia, to me, like when we did American Idiot, my son, Zach, he was 12 years old when he first heard American Idiot. Mm-hmm. And and it was known as a rock opera. And that just immediately got my attention. Like what, and because I had introduced Quadrophenia to him as well. And when I said, so what's American Idiot about? Because I had never heard it. And he's like, it's Quadrophenia. And that made me, that really made me happy, because I was just kind of like, okay, so that's the reason, like we did that episode, and it was, so that's why I brought Quadrophenia up so much. I apologize for that.
Well,
but that was my angle for coming into that episode. But that, to me, I think Billy Joel Armstrong, I think he says more about Tommy, obviously being the influence, but I think Quadrophenia is there. I think that, the sort of the angst, the teen, and in this case, the 90s kid, being confused about, it's not just his friends and the social thing that's happening, but also the politics of the time,
of course,
political time, the world at large, and how that's affecting the youth today as well. I mean, just sort of the mental state of,
absolutely.
So that, those themes are very much alive. And Townsend, I know, he's I think he's very sort of proud of those notions that people are still kind of, doing these kinds of things. And I think it was Eddie Vedder that said it best, though. He goes, "It really pisses me off. I hate the fact that the Who did it first. The Who did it all first. Like it didn't give us a chance to make something original as Tommy or Quadrophenia." That he goes, "It pisses me off that they did it on every turn, but he's just so such a fan, And by the way, I have look it up. I think they celebrated the Who. It might have been Quadrophenia specifically, but I'm not sure. But he does a rousing version of Real Me with Pearl Jam, and it's just amazing.
He's not afraid to show his roots. He's certainly and more so as he's getting older. He's really kind of leaning into appreciating that kind of stuff, and he's becoming known for those covers. He's known for doing those versions of songs. So as we close out, Chris, give me some final thoughts on Tommy.
I think it's, like I said, I think it's an important record. It does lay the foundation for not just the idea of creating a concept album or a rock opera or an album that tells a story, but just the idea of an artist doing something in Damn the Torpedoes and not being afraid to take a chance and do something different and do something unique, which is what art is supposed to be, and not trying to fit a mold or to make somebody happy, but to do something personal for yourself. And, I feel like it's influenced a lot of artists, as we've said. So that's why I think it's so important, as it really has endured and stood the test of time.
Cool. Mm-hmm. All right, Eric, final words on Quadrophenia.
I mean, it's been with me my whole life. I mean, it's my constant companion. Whether anybody knows that or not.
It's tough to find. It's tough to hear it this way, Chris.
I know, isn't it?
Find out this way.
To hear something like that at a very early age, and it could have very well been Tommy. If I had heard that first, I might feel differently. You just can't deny the impact that Tommy had on music at large, but it's just, but for me personally, I think Quadrophenia is just, I take it to heart. I take what he's writing about to heart, and just all the themes and what this kid's going through. And, I feel like, not to get too personal with it, but it's just, I totally identify with the character and just sort of the isolation and the loneliness growing up, because we weren't able to express ourselves, like the kids do today, and it's hard for them, but at least, there's conversations happening.
Sure.
Kids are talking about their feelings a hell of a lot more than we were able to back in the day. So those are the things that resonate with me. And then when, as a father, looking at my sons going through their angst and their, turmoil or whatever, I put this album on, even now, it's like, I can still, it never goes away. You know what I mean? So it's just very, very important.
Takes you right back.
Yeah.
It's a time machine.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, and absolutely. It feels like a memory. When you listen to it now, it feels like a dream, a memory, because it's recorded as such. Yeah. It just has that effect. Yeah, it's just an amazing record.
And to Eric's point, Tommy's been with me. I first heard Tommy when I was 10 years old, and it's been a part of just weaving into moments throughout my life. So again, it's been with me for 35 years. And if I came to like he said, maybe if I came to Quadrophenia first, I might feel differently, but it's very personal to me, the record and what it represents as far as a piece of music.
All right, kids, you've got your assignment. If you've never listened to Tommy and you listen to Quadrophenia, you got to listen to Tommy. If you've never listened to Quadrophenia or vice versa, you listen to Tommy, never listen to Quadrophenia, you got to listen to him. I did, and it was a great trip to take, and again, to Rock and Roll 101. to enhance your musical knowledge. And again, the Who have a very special place in rock history for having the audacity, the sheer brass balls on Pete Townsend to try and do it 3 times, and kind of did it 2.5 times in a row. Just that, it's emblematic of an era where anything went. The record companies were open to this kind of stuff, and letting someone be a genius or a mad scientist, right? And just kind of going with it and seeing where it leads, and that's something that you probably you don't see as much with music nowadays. So back then there was just that whole era of creativity, and all these artists were just, new genres were being created, like the rock opera. I mean, this stuff was just kind of being created on the fly, where it was just, we're going to do something different. And, what is it? Well, it's kind of like an opera, but it's rock and roll. So we'll call it a rock opera, so all this stuff was being coined and invented by these groups. As they were recording, they're going in with ideas, and let's see what happens. Let's see what develops. And you, like I said, you got, so, it could be one of the greatest 3-album cycles, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Tommy, Who's Next, and Quadrophenia. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to make a case that it's not one of the best 3-album cycles. So I think, we've done Who's Next. So if you like that sits right in the middle of these 2 releases. So again, as we've talked about with Chris many times, you can go back and do Tommy, or you can go forward where that sound from Who's Next is more refined, and it's taken and expanded on, and those ideas are expanded past a 1-album idea. So,
and if you really want to be ambitious, you start at a quick one and just move your way up through Quadrophenia, and you could see the evolution.
And then
I know Green Day did a cover of a quick one, which surprised the hell out of me.
Yeah.
That's dedication, man. That's going deep.
and actually, one of the best versions of that song is when the Who did it on Rock and Roll Circus. That's a phenomenal performance.
Yeah.
It's all out there.
Well, Dean, you didn't. You didn't tell us your preference.
Yep, there you go.
No, you didn't ask.
So what's your preference?
I'm asking.
Well, actually, I did kind of. I kind of answered it when we talked about which one is easier to listen to.
Okay.
I think if I'm going to, let me put it this way: if I'm going to revisit an album, it'll probably be Quadrophenia.
Okay.
Because in my mind, Tommy is kind of like a movie, and you've kind of gone through it and you've seen it.
Mm-hmm.
But Quadrophenia, I think there's more in there because it's less linear.
Yeah.
Right. And doesn't hold you by the hand. So if I'm in the mood for a story, I could see myself putting Tommy on because it moves pretty quick. The only problem I have with Tommy is the underture. It's just too fucking long, and it goes nowhere.
I can see that.
Like it really does. It's just kind of like, usually he puts snippets of the other song like that, but when I was listening to Underture today, I'm like, okay, 10 minutes and 35 seconds, here we go. And then it was just like it really wasn't anything. And it almost for me stopped the story because I was involved. Like we're listening to Christmas and Cousin Kevin, and I'm getting all this information. Then all of a sudden the story literally stops for 10 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
With nothing that was really kind of like there. It was just kind of like, all right, you really skidded this to a halt for me. That could easily be a stopping point for somebody that if somebody was kind of mildly interested in it and was listening to it, they might say, fuck it,
Yeah.
That's my only gripe about Tommy is the underture. It's just take that out and you've got to you probably saved yourself a side also.
That's true.
And you got like a humdinger. But for my money, because of the maturity of Daltrey's voice, I would definitely return to Quadrophenia because like Eric, I prefer 70s Elvis to 50s Elvis. Like the same reason. Like there's that maturity and there's that little growl and there's that cigarette or whiskey scratch to their voice. Maybe it's from singing. The same we said the same thing about Plant when we talked about Led Zeppelin 2. How from Led Zeppelin 1 to Led Zeppelin 2, he went from a child to like sounding really different.
I was gonna say, I will say, if you want to revisit Tommy, a good way to revisit it, and honestly, if I'm being honest, it's what I would probably listen to more is grab. There's an expanded box of like Live at Leeds, and it's on Spotify, or I'm sure it's on YouTube Music. And in the middle of this full performance at Leeds, they do Tommy from beginning to end, and then they do it at the Isle of Wight. And it's a coin toss. Either performance is phenomenal.
Well, there you go. Get the live.
Even the Join Together box set,
that's very good too.
Which was the '89 tour. I think that's the one where Steve Winwood and Phil Collins actually make guest appearances. Phil being Uncle Ernie, of course, and I think Steve Winwood plays Clapton's part, where he's the hawker.
So he's not sitting in the audience watching like he did in the concert for George.
No.
Did you ever see that? You ever see a concert for George, Chris?
Yeah.
Steve Winwood is sitting in the audience watching.
Nobody thought, say, "Hey man, grab a guitar."
Like what? Like it's prime. Like that's fucking Steve Winwood right there. He's kind of like in the front. Why is he not on stage? Like you don't have an extra keyboard. There's no extra DX7 in the back.
Oh my God!
Just put him in front of something. Just have him put his hands on the keys,
or just to sing. Man, that guy's got a great set of pipes.
Steve Winwood, for Christ's sake. Why is he in the audience?
Yeah.
Oh man,
poor guy. So at least he got he got his due. So I think that's going to do it. This was a great conversation. It was a great compare and contrast for again. For what usually you would do this with two groups, but this is one group with albums that have similar dynamics to them. So it was a great fun conversation. Christopher Clark, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, man. I'm glad to be a part of this conversation. Both albums are amazing to
it was a lot of fun. Like I said, definitely check it out. They're both very interesting listens. And they're two different experiences. So it's not they put them out pretty close, and they're not the same. Which also makes it very interesting too. It could have been very easy to kind of continue with
less than 5 years between both.
But a lot of differences. So that's going to do it. If you made it this far, go ahead and like and subscribe on YouTube so you get notified when new episodes come out. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Go ahead and comment about the episode. And if you like, within your favorite podcast platform, you can actually send us fan mail. We cannot respond to it. So if you got something nasty to say, we'll address it in public in front of everybody. But if you have something nice to say, well, we'll also address it in public too. But you can reach out to us that way as well. So
we'll address it in public.
We'll air the dirty laundry.
Damn it!
Something nasty, we're going to air that shit.
We'll do the laundry.
What's wrong with these people?
we're airing that dirty laundry, for Christ's sake.
Yeah,
warts and all. You're going to see it. So. But that's going to do it for this episode. For Chris, for Eric, this has been Dean. We'll catch you on the flip side.
You've been listening to the 3324 podcast with Dean Legiro and Eric Kuber. You can find us on your favorite podcast provider, so please like, subscribe, and rate to become a part of the 3324 family. Your feedback is important, so make sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at 3324 podcast and on Twitter at 3324p to join the conversation.